Is the ratio for every one mean thing you say, you have to say like 10 nice things to make up for it? Well, that explains why we had to sing God So Loved the World off after that treacherous reading that Rob was stuck with. So this is a rough one. Yeah. We'll see if there's any saving or good news. The boys and I have been reading a book by Christopher Paul Curtis at night called Bud Not Buddy. And as the inside or back cover of the book indicates, the book takes place in 1936 in Flint, Michigan. And Bud is a motherless child. He's 10 years old, but he has a few things. He has a suitcase filled with old belongings and memories, and he brings this suitcase with him from foster home to foster home or group home to group home. He has a small book that he has written entitled Bud Caldwell, that's him, Bud Caldwell's Rules and Things for Having a Funner Life and Making a Better Liar Out of Yourself. And the third thing he has are some old flyers, band posters indicating a local famous band called the Dusky Devastators of the Depression. And Bud has a clue that the leader of that band, Herman E. Calloway, might just be his dad. So the book is about Bud trying to find this out. And it's a great book because it is honest about how brutal life is and how unsteady people are. But even while facing that, you still have a main character who presses forward, who's resilient. One of the early chapters begins with Bud on the ground, and his knees are to his chest, and his hands are covering his face because his newest foster brother is beating him up. And while Bud's laying on the ground, he has a thought. He realizes that there comes a time when you're in a fight and you're losing and there's nothing you can do, and you just have to realize that enough is enough. And you have to quit trying. And I think there is some truth to Bud's wisdom there. You have to know when enough is enough, or when to walk away. And this isn't a point that is commonly acknowledged because we are supposed to be bootstraps people, always optimistic, keep trying, keep exerting your will. But the strange thing is that I have found, at least in my small sample size, and maybe it's peculiar to me and my family, I have found that I have had the least success with certain people when I'm very forceful. When I tell them they must do something, they must eat something, they must, and they say no. Ironically, what has often worked is when I step back, if I'm brave enough, and I put my hands up and say, it's up for you to decide. I love you. It's your life. You're in control. And then I get the results I wanted. Quite a lot. And it makes me wonder if the best thing we can do for other people sometimes is to just quit trying, to let them go, to let them know that the door is always open. You can come or you can leave. It's up to you. Well, in our reading today, God is at the end of his rope. He had a vineyard, a beautiful vineyard, fertile soil. God cleared it of stones and planted it with choice vines and built a watchtower, hewed out a wine vat. It's the most perfect vineyard. It should yield succulent, delicious grapes. Grapes that always do what they're told to do and practice their instruments and go to college and obtain gainful employment and get married and have kids and go to church. But the grapes are rotten. The vineyard turns out to be wild. It's filled with thorns. And it makes the keeper of the vineyard weep. So how does God handle such a difficult child? What does God do in a situation like this? Well, it seems like maybe God takes a lesson from Bud Caldwell's Book of Rules for Life. God, more or less, says enough is enough. And God gives up on this vineyard, removes the hedges, breaks down the walls. There's no pruning or hoeing or water. God just lets the vineyard become a waste, and it's overgrown with briars and thorns. There's a moment quite like this in the Gospels. Jesus is nearing the end of his ministry. He has already set his face towards Jerusalem, the expression the writer uses to explain how he is preparing for his death. And the one thing that Jesus wants before he dies is to taste a fig. So he walks up to a fig tree, but there are no figs on it. And he curses the tree. May you never bear fruit again, Jesus says. So the vineyard keeper gives up on the vineyard. Jesus gives up on that fig tree. And maybe this is supposed to mean that God gives up on Judah or Israel or us. And I just mentioned a few moments ago how sometimes giving up is a good thing because it's a savvy long-term parenting technique that may produce self-sufficiency and motivation. But I don't think that's what's at stake here, because our situation as human beings is so dire that if God gives up on us, that's it. We've got nothing. So maybe if we could just ask God to look a little bit more closely at the vineyard. God, see if you can find a few good grapes, sort of like Abraham negotiating with God about Sodom. Maybe if there are 10 righteous people, 10 good grapes, will you save the vineyard? Or maybe we can think that about the world. Maybe if there are just a few good people, the world would be worth saving. Or maybe you can look in the mirror and just think, if you focus on your redeeming qualities, if you soar with your strengths in corporate speak, maybe God will find you to be worth saving. But God inspects that vineyard. God inspects Sodom and Gomorrah. God inspects our hearts. And maybe God doesn't find anything. And maybe God gives up. And maybe this is the greatest news in the world. Because we know that God does save us. And we know that God so loves the world. But if that salvation is contingent upon God first finding a few good things inside of you, if that salvation is contingent upon you first doing a few good things, then what will that mean when each of us inevitably comes to one of those moments in life when you are utterly wrecked because your relationship has fallen apart and it cannot be saved? Because once again, you've dug a grave with your awful mouth. Because your child won't speak to you. Because the diagnosis is so grim that there is no treatment or cure available. And the people who are around you may try to pep you up and appeal to good things that they see in you or suggest impossible cures. But you really know because you are the one who is closest to it, and you know there is nothing worth hoping for or saving in this moment. And the one person in the world who will understand where you are will be God. The God who lets this vineyard go. And the greatest news in the world is that God does save this vineyard. God does save us, not because God finds a few good grapes or a few good things within us, but because God enacts something that is incredible, unbelievable, and impossible. God extends grace, not because we bring it about or initiate it, because God just decides to bring it about. This is the second part of the reading that Rob shared. how God will not judge the world by what his eyes see or decide what to do by what his ears see, because God might not see anything good or hear anything good. But nevertheless, God still loves and saves the world and comes to us as Christ, inhabiting all this hopelessness, becoming like us, encountering the darkest moments, and then dying. And when God dies, God doesn't come back because all of us are outside the tomb cheering God on, convincing God, you should come back and save us. God comes back and saves us because God will do what God will do, and who we are or what we have done doesn't have any bearing upon that. God gives up on giving up, and God saves the world. When Cal was in first grade, every week his teacher would invite people from the students' families to come and do an art project with the kids on Fridays. Doesn't that sound nice? Well, it was every Friday. Every Friday. And there were always some kids who had some people from their family who would come. Dad, Anderson's mom is always there. Can't you come? So you are drowning at work, but you decide to take some time off, and you show up at school, and you find yourself sitting in a little chair at a little table doing a really big project. And you suddenly start sweating. And you remember when you were in first grade doing very complicated art projects, and there were so many steps, and you're feeling that similar pressure, that similar feeling of lostness. And your own child is looking at you, because the apple doesn't fall far from the tree when it comes to aptitude with arts and crafts. And you know your child is depending on you to successfully complete this art project. And you look across the table. And Trina's grandmother is helping Trina. They're doing quite well. Psst, Cal, why don't you ask Trina's grandma how to do this step? And Grandma sees us, and she helps us. Whew. But then the next step is even harder. Trina's grandma sees us again and helps us again. But there's always another step. Trina's grandma looks at us one last time, and she says, "Oh, I give up." And she takes the art project from us. She gives it back to us, and it's all done. It's the greatest news in the world.